Did Rachel Maddow really just lose it on live television? The question ricocheted across millions of screens in an instant, echoing through living rooms, group chats, and social feeds like a sudden crack of thunder. One moment, the air was filled with the predictable rhythm of another late-night panel debate. The next, Maddow's voice erupted like a siren, breaking glass. Viewers leaned in, half in disbelief, half in awe, as her frustration boiled over into a scream so raw that even her own co-hosts shifted uncomfortably. It was supposed to be routine. Maddow, the seasoned media heavyweight, had navigated countless heated discussions before. But something about Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's words pierced deeper, slicing through her polished armor. Perhaps it was the composure with which Crockett spoke, or the undeniable weight of her truth. Whatever it was, Maddow lost her grip, her voice rising higher, sharper, until it was less analysis and more an outburst that felt impossible to ignore. And then, in the kind of moment that live television can never script, Crockett leaned forward, calm as still water against the storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She delivered a line so precise, so cutting, it felt like time itself froze. Her words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a clapback woven with the steel of lived experience, a statement that instantly traveled faster than Maddow's outburst itself. Viewers clipped it, replayed it, shared it, branding it the sentence that broke the internet. Phones lit up with notifications. Twitter feeds exploded with hashtags. TikTok stitched and remixed the line within seconds. Memes were born before the commercial break even arrived. Maddow had screamed, but it was Crockett's restraint, her razor-sharp clarity, that ignited a firestorm across the digital landscape. For Maddow, it was a rare stumble. For Crockett, it was a defining moment, a chance to show millions not just who she was, but what she stood for. And in that instant, the power dynamics flipped. What was supposed to be another pundit's takedown became a showcase of dignity triumphing over outrage. But what she said next would flip the entire conversation upside down. The scream wasn't just the slip of the tongue, it was a symptom of something deeper, a crack in the polished veneer of America's televised politics. For years, Rachel Maddow had built her reputation as one of the most commanding voices in cable news, a figure who could tilt conversations, frame narratives, and decide which stories the nation would obsess over. She wasn't just a host, she was a cultural force. Her words shaped dinner table debates, fueled Twitter storms, and carved the angles by which millions understood the world. But in that moment, against Jasmine Crockett, her dominance looked fragile. Maddow represented the old guard of media power, well-financed, polished, and rehearsed. Crockett represented something newer, something raw. She wasn't polished for the sake of approval. She was authentic, rooted in her district, and unafraid of challenging both opponents and the establishment. It was a generational collision, a clash not just of personalities, but of eras. The tension had been building long before this night. Across America, viewers had grown restless with the predictable rhythms of political television, the endless panels, the talking heads who rarely left the comfort of their studios, the outrage cycles that recycled themselves every week. It all felt stale. Crockett was different. Her voice carried the grit of real battles, the cadence of someone who didn't just analyze policy, but thought through it. And when Maddow raised her voice, it wasn't just about disagreeing with Crockett's statement, it was about trying to silence what that statement represented. Because underneath the scream lay the heart of the debate. Who gets to control the narrative of America's future? Was it still the media titans who wrapped stories in carefully chosen words and statistics? Or was it the new wave of leaders, unfiltered, unapologetic, and unwilling to bow to convention? The stakes went beyond Maddow's ego or Crockett's clapback. They tapped into three forces reshaping the nation's soul. First, freedom of speech. The idea that no voice, whether a host's or a congresswoman's, should dominate so fully that others are drowned out. Second, media bias. The growing suspicion that networks protect their own narratives rather than the truth. And third, generational shifts. The undeniable rise of younger, more diverse voices demanding a seat at the table. Maddow's scream was more than a reaction, it was an alarm bell. It revealed the discomfort of a gatekeeper watching the gates weaken. Crockett's response wasn't just a retort, it was a declaration that new voices couldn't be ignored any longer. This wasn't a small panel clash, it was a snapshot of America's turning point. And as viewers watched, they felt it. They weren't just hearing Crockett clap back at Maddow. They were hearing themselves, their frustration with being silenced, their hunger for authenticity, their pride in leaders who looked like them, sounded like them, fought for them. Millions were watching, but no one expected the tidal wave of reactions that followed. To understand the weight of that scream, you have to understand the world Rachel Maddow has built around herself. For years, she has been the queen of progressive cable television, the face that millions of loyal viewers trusted to deliver not just the news, but the framing of the news. Maddow didn't simply report. She interpreted, she spun, she infused every headline with the kind of theatrical gravity that could transform a dry hearing into a crusade. And in doing so, she became more than a journalist. She became an institution. But with that institution came arrogance. Maddow's authority rested not on balance, but on certainty. Night after night, she leaned into a style that blurred the line between commentary and sermon, offering not just facts, but verdicts. To her fans, this was comforting. To her critics, it was manipulative. And in both camps, the same truth lingered. Maddow commanded the room by sheer force of personality. She didn't listen to debate, she controlled it. Over the years, this approach created its own controversies. There were moments where her passion spilled over, tipping from conviction into something harsher. She was known to raise her voice, to interrupt, to steamroll anyone who dared challenge her framing. It wasn't that Maddow couldn't debate, it was that she often chose not to, preferring instead to dominate, to overwhelm with intensity until her opponent's voice was swallowed whole. And yet, her veneer of control was fragile. Beneath the confident posture, there was a fragility that surfaced whenever someone pushed back with clarity. Critics often pointed out how visibly rattled she became when her narrative was pierced, how quickly her composure gave way to irritation. The louder her opponents spoke, the more Maddow fought to drown them out, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a jab, and occasionally with an outright eruption. Her career was studded with such moments. There was the infamous election night monologue where her disbelief at the results bled into open frustration, leaving even sympathetic viewers unsettled. There were countless interviews where Maddow's interruptions eclipsed her guests entirely, turning discussions into lectures. And there were the viral clips, times when her dramatic delivery became so exaggerated that late-night comedians couldn't resist parodying her. Each moment chipped away at the myth of Maddow's invincibility, hinting that behind the sharp glasses and sharper wit was someone perpetually one provocation away from unraveling. Still, the machinery of her platform protected her. MSNBC wasn't just her stage, it was her fortress. Producers, segment editors, and loyal viewers kept her reputation intact. Even when her passion blurred into bias, the echo chamber amplified her authority. In a world where television optics mattered more than truth, Maddow had the advantage. She knew the camera loved her intensity, and she wielded it like a weapon. But there was a difference between controlling a broadcast and controlling a clash. On her own show, Maddow decided the pacing, the framing, the cuts to commercial. In front of someone like Jasmine Crockett, however, she had no such power. Crockett wasn't a guest to be managed, nor a talking point to be steered. She was a rising congresswoman with her own platform, her own audience, and, perhaps most importantly, her own authenticity. Maddow's usual strategies, cutting in, raising her voice, stretching time to wear down the opposition, suddenly looked less like confidence and more like desperation. And desperation was not a good look for someone so entrenched in authority. When Maddow screamed, it didn't land as righteous anger. It landed as loss of control. For viewers used to seeing her as the voice of reason, the eruption was jarring. For those already skeptical of her bias, it was confirmation. The cracks that had always been there widened into full view. What made the moment even more devastating for Maddow was timing. In an era when authenticity is valued above polish, when younger generations scroll past lectures but stop for clapbacks, her scream looked dated, almost desperate. Crockett, by contrast, looked modern, calm, sharp, attuned to the rhythm of social media culture. The clash wasn't just generational, it was technological, cultural, symbolic. Maddow was television past, Crockett was politics future. For years, Maddow had been able to mask this fragility, but not tonight. Not against someone who refused to play the game by Maddow's rules. not against someone whose silence, poise, and perfectly timed words carried more weight than all the volume in the world. But this time, Maddow's outrage wasn't just heard, it was exposed. Before Jasmine Crockett's words echoed across the nation, before her viral clapback became a cultural moment, she had already walked a path that forged her into the very definition of resilience. To understand the power of that instant, you have to understand the woman behind it. Crockett didn't enter politics as a polished insider groomed by elite institutions. She entered it through grit. The daughter of a working-class family in Texas, she learned early that life was not fair, and justice was something you had to fight for tooth and nail. School wasn't just a place to learn. It was a battleground where she discovered her voice. While others were told to sit down and be quiet, Jasmine learned to stand up and speak, not just for herself, but for anyone silenced by power. Her entry into law wasn't born from privilege, but necessity. She watched her community bear the brunt of inequities, and she knew someone had to fight back in the courtroom. Becoming an attorney wasn't just a career choice, it was armor. She wielded the law the way a warrior wields a shield, defending those who couldn't afford expensive representation, battling systems stacked against the powerless. Each client she represented, each injustice she challenged, built her reputation as a voice unafraid of confrontation, unafraid of power, unafraid of those who believed they were untouchable. But the transition from law to politics wasn't simple. She didn't have billionaire donors lining up to fuel her campaign. What she had was community. What she had was truth. Her speeches weren't the rehearsed jargon of career politicians. They were raw, electric, and human. She could look a voter in the eye and speak their struggle back to them in a way that felt real, because she had lived it. She wasn't there to be polite. She wasn't there to fit into the Washington mold. She was there to break it. And that sharp wit didn't come from clever consultants or polished communications teams. It came from years of being underestimated, of having to outthink, outtalk, and outmaneuver those who wanted her silence. Every time someone rolled their eyes at the young black woman in the room, every time someone told her she was too much, every time someone tried to push her to the sidelines, she turned that dismissal into fuel. By the time she entered Congress, she was more than a politician. She was a force. Her colleagues quickly learned that dismissing Crockett came at a cost. She didn't just speak with passion, she spoke with precision. She was calm where others were chaotic, sharp where others rambled, grounded where others blustered. Her reputation grew when Crockett took the mic. People listened, not just because they wanted to, but because they had to. And here is where the drama sharpens. Crockett's rise represented something larger than one woman's ambition. It embodied the generational shift shaking American politics. While Maddow built her empires on the old rhythms of outrage-driven media, Crockett symbolized a new, unfiltered energy. She was not beholden to the tired scripts of left versus right punditry. She was the voice of lived experience, of community, of authenticity. In her, people saw the pride of identity and the fire of resilience. So when Rachel Maddow, the established titan of cable news commentary, let her fury spill unchecked on live television, it was not simply a moment of drama. It was a collision of eras. Maddow, with all her prestige and cultivated authority, versus Crockett, with her raw truth and unshakable calm. The irony was poetic. Maddow had made a career out of grilling politicians, of unmasking hypocrisy, of commanding the space with righteous certainty. But in this clash, it was Maddow who unraveled, and it was Crockett who held her ground. The lawyer in her knew that emotion is no substitute for logic. The advocate in her knew that the loudest voice is not always the truest. The woman in her knew that generations of voices had been silenced, and she was not about to join them. Crockett's past prepared her for this showdown in ways Maddow could not have imagined. She had been told no before. She had been told to be quiet before. She had seen the sneers, the dismissals, the subtle condescension that came with being both young and black in spaces dominated by older, louder voices, and every single one of those experiences became bricks in the foundation of her poise. Where Maddow's authority came from a studio, Crockett's authority came from a lifetime. And so as Maddow's voice rose and her composure cracked, Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Her silence,
Her calm, her steady gaze, all of it communicated what words could not. She had been here before. She knew how this played out. The audience could feel it too. They weren't just watching another heated panel exchange. They were witnessing a generational drama, a new kind of political figure refusing to bend to old power. And then came her clapback. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frantic. It was sharp, deliberate, and devastating. The kind of line that didn't just pierce Maddow in the moment, but reverberated through every corner of the internet. Because it wasn't just about Maddow. It was about every entrenched voice that thought they could scream down the future. Crockett's words carried more than rebuttal. They carried history, pride, and defiance. This was why the internet exploded. This was why millions watched the clip again and again, because Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she embodied something bigger. She was proof that calm strength could dismantle arrogance, that the future could stare the past in the face and refuse to bow. And in this moment, Crockett's past gave her the strength to deliver one of the most viral clapbacks of the year. The studio lights were blinding, the air thick with anticipation, and the nation's gaze fixed on one stage. What began as a tense policy discussion quickly turned into something far more dramatic. A battle of wills between an entrenched media powerhouse and a rising congressional voice. Rachel Maddow, the face of polished primetime commentary, leaned forward in her chair, her voice raised to a pitch that carried both urgency and frustration. Her interruption came sharp and cutting, slicing through the air before Jasmine Crockett could finish her thought. No, hold on, that's not what we're talking about here. Maddow's words tumbled over Crockett's sentence like a tidal wave, her hands slicing the air in agitation, her face taut with indignation. She wasn't asking for clarity, she was demanding control. Crockett paused, her lips closing gently as she leaned back in her chair. The camera caught the slightest arch of her brow, a signal that she would not be rushed, not be steamrolled. She folded her hands in front of her, as if gathering strength from silence itself. The contrast was striking. Maddow's flurry of words and hand gestures versus Crockett's calm, poised stillness. Each attempt Maddow made to press her dominance grew louder. She rattled off statistics, hurled rhetorical questions, and repeated talking points with a staccato rhythm, her frustration mounting with every syllable. At one point, she almost rose from her chair, her voice bordering on a shout. Gasps rippled through the audience in the studio. At home, viewers gripped their remotes, sensing they were watching more than an exchange. They were witnessing a power struggle erupt live on air. Meanwhile, Crockett's silence stretched, not as weakness, but as a weapon. She waited. Her eyes never left Maddow. The tension was so thick it almost had a sound of its own. The quiet before a storm that everyone knew was coming. On social media, clips began spreading in real time. Captions appeared on TikTok. Crockett's face says it all. And then, after Maddow's final barrage, there was a pause. The studio air went still. Crockett leaned forward at last, her voice low, deliberate, measured. The power in her delivery wasn't volume, it was precision. She let Maddow's words hang in the air, heavy and unchecked, before slicing them apart with a single, perfectly timed sentence. The shift was instant, electric. The audience leaned in, phones buzzed. Across living rooms and timelines, millions felt the same rush of anticipation. And then, just like that, everything shifted. The silence before it happened was almost theatrical. Maddow had just finished a fiery barrage, her voice cracking slightly from the strain of pressing the same point over and over. The room was hot with tension, cameras catching every twitch and flicker of expression. And then came the pause, the kind of pause that makes everyone instinctively lean closer to their screens, waiting, almost breathless. Jasmine Crockett shifted slightly in her chair, straightening her shoulders with the grace of someone who had weathered storms before. Her lips parted slowly, not to rush into defense, but to deliver something far more deliberate. Her voice came out calm, measured, cutting through the haze of Maddow's noise like a scalpel through fabric. See, Rachel, the problem here isn't that I don't understand you. It's that you don't seem to understand yourself. It was surgical. Crockett didn't raise her voice, she didn't wave her hands or rush her words. Each syllable landed with weight, and the room immediately registered the shift. Maddow blinked, stunned. the camera catching the flush that rose faintly across her cheeks. The crowd reacted first with a sharp gasp, a ripple of electricity moving across the studio. Crockett let the reaction hang, then leaned forward, eyes steady on Maddow. "You've made a career out of mistaking passion for proof, but passion doesn't rewrite facts, and tonight, facts are exactly what we're dealing with."
Maddow, usually the picture of control, now looked undone. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her pen, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim footing. That's not fair," she exclaimed, but the words only drew another ripple of laughter from the audience. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply leaned back in her chair, the very image of composure, and let Maddow flail. It was a reversal so complete that it almost felt scripted, but it wasn't. It was the natural consequence of calm meeting chaos and winning. The media response was instantaneous. Commentators who had spent years praising Maddow's dominance suddenly pivoted. Headlines began drafting themselves. Crockett dismantles Maddow in live Showdown. Pundits tweeted their disbelief. "I've covered politics for 20 years, and I've never seen Rachel Maddow this unhinged." What made the moment so devastating wasn't just Crockett's words, but the way she said them. No shouting, no frantic gestures, just a steady presence that exposed Maddow's outburst for what it was: fragile, desperate, and hollow. By the time the segment ended, the narrative had flipped entirely. Maddow's reputation as the untouchable voice of media authority lay cracked on the studio floor, while Crockett walked away elevated, her reputation as sharp, fearless, and unshakable solidified in front of millions. The last image many viewers saw before the broadcast cut to commercial was Maddow's face, red and tight, her jaw clenched as she scribbled furiously on her notes. Beside her, Crockett sat still, head high, a quiet confidence radiating from her. And as the clip spread online, the story took on a life of its own. The clip had barely ended on television when it exploded onto the internet like wildfire. Within minutes, the words Jasmine Crockett had spoken were being replayed, reshared, and remixed across every platform imaginable. Twitter lit up with all caps reactions. TikTok creators stitched the clip with stunned faces, adding captions like, "She did not just say that." Memes flew faster than anyone could keep track of. Maddow's wide-eyed reaction plastered with captions like, "When you realize the narrative isn't yours anymore." Hashtags Crockett clap back and Maddow meltdown surged, pulling in millions of views within hours. This wasn't just another political skirmish on cable news. It was spectacle. It was drama. And people were hooked. For progressives, it was validation, the sense that someone had finally stepped into the arena and held their ground against a media giant who for too long had controlled the flow of the conversation. For conservatives watching, it was schadenfreude, proof that even the most untouchable figures in left-leaning media could be rattled by truth spoken with unshakable calm. By the sunrise, celebrities were chiming in. Actors, comedians, and musicians all shared the clip with their own takes. Some celebrated Crockett as a new cultural icon. Others ridiculed Maddow's inability to contain her fury. Talk show hosts replayed the moment in monologues, adding jokes that made late-night audiences roar with laughter. And in the political world, the shockwaves cut even deeper. Members of Congress tweeted cryptic references, while pundits debated whether this marked a beginning of a generational shift in who truly holds the microphone in American politics. The numbers told the story best. Over 20 million views on Twitter in less than 12 hours, hashtags trending globally, comment sections filled with a mixture of applause, disbelief, and awe. People who had never once tuned in to Maddow's program now knew her face for the wrong reasons, her flustered meltdown frozen forever in viral loops. And Jasmine Crockett? Overnight, she was no longer just a rising member of Congress. She was a symbol, a fighter who, with a single clapback, had changed the tone of an entire debate. But the story wasn't without cost. Maddow's camp scrambled to regain control. Their defenders claimed the clip was taken out of context. They argued that Crockett's line, while sharp, had been overblown by the echo chamber of social media. But the more they tried to spin the narrative, the more it slipped through their fingers. The internet doesn't wait for corrections. It amplifies emotion, and this time all the energy was surging in Crockett's direction. For Crockett, the days that followed were surreal. Invitations poured in from major outlets asking for interviews. Young voters hailed her as the voice of a new political generation. Activist groups replayed the clip at rallies as if it were a battle hymn, proof that truth spoken boldly could pierce through the loudest of platforms. And parents told their children to watch the moment as an example of standing tall under fire. It wasn't just a viral video, it was an emblem of resilience. Meanwhile, Maddow's brand suffered a wound she could not ignore. For years, she had thrived on being the one asking the sharpest questions, holding others to account with intensity. But now the narrative had turned. Her own credibility was under scrutiny. Did her outburst reveal arrogance, fragility, fear? Audiences debated endlessly, and in the marketplace of perception, perception was everything. What no one could deny was the cultural power of the clash. It had tapped into something deeper than partisan squabbling. It revealed the fragility of media giants when confronted with fresh, fearless voices. It captured the hunger of a generation tired of scripted sound bites, eager for authenticity no matter how messy it looked on camera. And it showed the world that power wasn't confined to the anchor's chair anymore. Power had shifted to the one bold enough to speak without trembling. Yet, even in the glow of Crockett's triumph, whispers of caution emerged. Some warned her not to become defined by one viral moment. Others questioned whether the same media machine that elevated her could later try to break her. Still, for the millions watching, the meaning was clear. This was more than a skirmish between two women on live TV. It was a collision of eras, a passing of the torch from the old guard of media dominance to the raw, unscripted energy of a new generation. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. The world would not forget this clash. Maddow's scream, Crockett's clapback, the silence that followed. It had all been etched into the digital bloodstream of the nation. But beyond the chaos of viral reactions, the deeper lesson was just beginning to emerge. When the dust finally settled, the moment that had begun as a clash of tempers revealed itself as something far greater. It was no longer about Maddow's outburst, nor even about the viral nature of Crockett's clapback. It became a parable, a lesson about how dignity can triumph over arrogance and how truth spoken calmly can silence even the loudest storms. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were reminded of what leadership looks like when it is rooted in principle rather than ego. Crockett's dignity turned a heated exchange into an enduring example of resilience in the face of chaos. For weeks afterwards, analysts continued to dissect the encounter, but ordinary Americans understood it instantly. They saw a woman who refused to be rattled, who didn't meet fire with fire, but instead let composure serve as her shield and her weapon. In a political landscape too often defined by shouting matches and theatrical outrage, Crockett reminded people that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in measured tones, cutting deeper because of its restraint. The moral of this clash extended beyond two individuals. It touched the very heart of American values, the belief in free speech, in the courage to stand firm, and in the power of generational change. Maddow represented the entrenched media order, the guardians of narratives, who often assume the right to define what truth should look like. Crockett represented a new wave, younger, sharper, unafraid to call out bias, and unwilling to let tradition silence progress. It was the classic story of an old guard meeting a challenger whose voice carries the weight of lived experience and unshakable conviction. As the clip spread to millions, the lesson crystallized. Arrogance may dominate the microphone, but it cannot withstand composure. Rage may command attention, but it cannot inspire. The power that endures is the power rooted in truth. Crockett's line didn't simply end a debate, it reminded people of their own capacity to stand tall in the face of disrespect, to defend themselves without losing their cool, and to insist that dignity is non-negotiable. And so, the viral moment became more than a meme. It became a reflection of what America hungers for: leadership that inspires rather than intimidates, voices that uplift rather than belittle. Crockett's calm defiance became a beacon for anyone who has ever been talked over, dismissed, or underestimated. In that single clapback, millions saw the power of composure over chaos, and they carried that image with them as a reminder that true strength is not in the scream, but in the steady voice that cannot be broken. And so, the headline became reality. Rachel Maddow screams over Jasmine Crockett's statement. Her clapback goes viral instantly. What started as a moment of raised voices ended as proof that composure can cut deeper than chaos. Maddow's scream may have grabbed attention, but it was Crockett's calm, unshakable response that truly echoed. Her words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a reminder that truth, when spoken with dignity, doesn't need volume to carry weight. This clash left no doubt about the moral clarity at stake. On one side, arrogance dressed as authority; on the other, dignity wrapped in truth. And when the two collided, it wasn't noise that won. It was strength rooted in self-control. Crockett showed America and the world that in an era where outrage is currency, dignity is still priceless. But here's the larger truth. This wasn't just Crockett's victory. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be silenced, to anyone who has ever faced condescension and chosen principle over panic. Her clapback wasn't simply viral entertainment. It was a blueprint, a reminder that you don't have to shout to be heard, and that sometimes the calmest voice delivers the sharpest blow. If you believe dignity always beats arrogance, share this story. Amplify the lesson. Join Briefboard in holding power accountable, not through rage or noise, but through truth, composure, and courage. Because moments like this aren't just viral clips, they're reminders of who we are and who we still have the power to become. The screen may fade, but the clapback and its lesson will keep echoing.